What's up, people? Your boy John here. I'm gonna do something a little different today, as you can see from the screen. We're gonna be ranking all the Beethoven movements. Now, I did a little bit of preparation for this, but, you know, little loosey goosey. So, here's how it goes. All my opinions, super subjective, so if you disagree, something that needs to be bumped up, do let me know what your favorite is, something that maybe you grew up with. Let me know how Beethoven has become personable to you. Because, this is all about how I grew up with Beethoven. So, not a real objective look at things, but I don't know. I feel like I have a good sense for how they go. So, what are the rankings? We got S, A, B, C, and D. Kind of the way as I was preparing for this, the way that I've been thinking about it, D is kind of like, it's good. You can listen to it at any time, but it's kind of hard to say that it's Beethoven or that it is really up to the same standards as some of his other symphonies. So I'm not saying they're bad music. I would listen to it like any day of the week. It's just like not really up to par with the other ones. Um, so C is when you want to just kind of Beethoven fairly well already, and you want to kind of branch out and hear all the different Beethoven stuff out there. Still good, very Beethoven, but as you go on, let's say you are on to B. Starting at B is when you start recommending these pieces out to your friends. And so if your friends already know some of the really good stuff and there's some other really good stuff and other movements that aren't so popular, that's where B is. So if somebody is like really into the third, fifth symphonies, say, hey, check out some of these other stuff. And it gets a little dicey and controversial. B is, I would say, like probably the trickiest one. A is good, like real good, like super Beethoven, uh, great stuff. You're engaged, you're listening, and you feel absorbed in the music. You're part of it. But S is what I like to consider sublime, like beyond human understanding. It's like this guy just suddenly, Beethoven just like, I know exactly what heaven and hell is like. And I'm going to paint a picture through orchestral music to get to this idea and this vision. Something way beyond what we as mere mortals might think of. And Beethoven was just trying his best to bring those types of essences down to our lowly lives, you know? So S is really just up there. I tried to think of like a criteria to determine where each of them are, but it's just like, how do you make like an objective, real criteria on where things lie? So it's like, I made like a couple decisions here and there. But hopefully the way that I describe the tiers is satisfactory enough. It's like how easily can you recommend these things? D is like, I would never recommend anybody listen to it if they wanted to listen to Beethoven. C is kind of on the fringe of, oh, you haven't checked these out? Try it out. B is like, good. Uh, and then A and S are where you start saying, oh, yeah, this is peak classical music. Best stuff out there. So this one's going to probably take a while, so I'm going to be, editing this out because I'm going to be saying stuff, but I would also like to be listening a little bit to remind myself. I know these symphonies very well, but I want to get in the right mood, so I'm going to be listening to each of these movements a little bit before talking about them. But I will say that I have already made the tier list, And so I already know where they're going to be. I just want to make sure that I got all the fine points out. And some of them are going to be much longer than others. Yeah. So, without further ado, let's get started. Pull up my notes here because I wrote quite a lot of notes. So, you gotta understand that when the first symphony was being written, that Beethoven was still really much under the oversight of Haydn, and that Beethoven was operating kind of confined in the Haydn school. And so when the first symphony comes out, it's kind of difficult because Beethoven wants to make his mark because it's his first symphony, but at the same time, um, he kind of has to appease some of these academic overlords, you know. But that quickly goes away. So what I'm glad to say is that the first symphony is fun. It's good. And what's kind of new about Beethoven's symphonies is that many of them have a slow prelude, and then they go into the first movement. And what's fantastic about this first movement is that you already tell this is not Haydn, right? So that's one of the best parts is like new composer, new symphony, new identity, and Beethoven really tried to capture himself in there, right? Very solid, very upbeat. Still has this kind of classical fanfare type of ideas. Oh shoot. We got a lot of yard work suddenly coming on now. So yeah, what can I say? It's a little still elementary. It kind of seems like, with the perspective of all his other symphonies, that the first one seems a little like it could use some further development. It kind of seems a little cheap and childish, which a big majority of Haydn and Mozart's works is how I would describe that, is cheap and childish. So there are some like some of it later on the becomes less of like a standalone motif, and he starts going more of like effects, right? So right now there's still like classical ideas, like little measures of tidbit snacks. That's kind of how and that phrase will come up a little bit, is like, are you creating snacks or are you creating a meal? And right now it's just Beethoven still creating a couple snacks here and there. But like I said, super solid. So first movement is gonna go in the B tier. Cool. Well, that was 8 minutes. This is going to take a long time. So now, Beethoven's second movements tend to be very painters-like. You can almost see that he has like a paintbrush and is just painting this nice, almost pastel, very, I don't know. That's just kind of how I describe it. But this identity of taking your conductor's baton and actually making it into a paintbrush, that gets stronger and stronger as you go. So, but otherwise, nothing super crazy to say about the second movement. It's nice music, and I think it really is, again, setting the tone for a lot of the second movements that are coming up in the symphony. So, another B tier. And going along with this whole idea of like formative ideas and such, you get third movements that are generally very jubilant, very rhythmic, very dance-like, and there's always some sort of rhythmic idea behind every one of them. And it's easy to like uh, fall into that rhythm. It's very catchy stuff. But one thing about it is that it's very repetitive. This third movement is very repetitive. Not just only in just like bars by bars, but notes by notes. The notes can get very repetitive, which again shows that we're not quite detached from this whole Haydn era of music and sound. So more diversity and more density, that stuff comes later. But already establishing identity. So would you believe it? We got another B tier. And the finale for the first symphony is quite different from a lot of the other stuff prior to the symphonies, because right now is when all the horns are starting to become metallic, that the process for creating these new brass instruments is starting to become finalized. And so now Beethoven's able to harness the power of brass in ways that previous composers have not yet been able to do. So there's a little bit more of this like industrial era creeping in to Beethoven's way of orchestrating things. Um, but I think the main benefit to this fourth movement is that the one, two, and three were just nice music. Cool, nice to listen to. But movement four, in particular, things are up in the air. You, as an audience member, are actually starting to get invited. Your curiosity is piqued, your attention is piqued. You want to know what's coming next. And also, the whole little bits of trickery, humor, manic energy, that's all coming in here. So I think this is the first time, uh, unlike the other movements, where you as a listener are starting to anticipate things that are no longer Haydn-esque, no longer very typical and satisfactory resolutions. Things are getting a little bit more tricky, but this is just the beginning. The beginning of Beethoven saying, hold on a minute, this music goes on a little bit longer, and then you're constantly wanting to know what's next. And suddenly, that resolution is way more powerful because as you go on into the symphonies, that tension can get longer and longer and longer. So, still the idea of overarching suspense and tension starting to build up, all these like horns and brass coming in, is, just the creating the right breeding ground for some great Beethoven that comes up later. I personally like the fourth movement pretty well. I think the finale is quite good. So I'm going to rank this finale, up here. So yeah, I'm going to arrange the movements so the left side of it is better than what's on the right side. Yeah. Good. So overall, Symphony 1, very solid, has that good old Beethoven identity, and you get to really see a bit of that transformation of Beethoven really embedding himself into the music that he writes. Cool. Now, as I was saying about classical expectations that Haydn and Mozart would create is like in an audience's mind of current classical music understanding at the time, people were used to things that Haydn Mozart did. And so to step away from that but also understand that structure of understanding exists, Beethoven again starts questioning, can I take us away from that expectation for a while and then bring us back? And that subversion of expectation is really, you see more and more and more of it as you keep going on. and every single time it gets a bit more satisfying. But I will say that Symphony 2 is when he really starts getting into this deeper, denser music. Um, you can argue is it romantic or not, but I think it's still uh, within those classic conventions. Um, so it's still guessable. You can still guess what's going to happen. And it's not very surprising, you know? Like, you still can anticipate what's coming next, and you're correct. Later on, you will start wanting to anticipate something else and being incorrect, and realizing Beethoven's choice was actually way cooler and better than what you could have possibly expected. Um, so I'm going to put in Symphony Movement 1 solid. It's got this new density and darkness behind Beethoven that really steps away from some of these other previous ideas of density. And you'll find that later on I'll note that in this piece, in this symphony, a minor chord still has the idea of a minor idea, sad, angry, right? But later on, you'll find that Beethoven transforms minor chords within the harmonic structure to provide energy and that propels the harmony forward, right? So, why is this solid? Why is it not above? It's that it's predictable still, and um, yeah, and the other stuff that I said, which I don't remember. One thing also to notice is that with the second symphony, he starts to expect more from people. So he expects more from the performers. Like the symphony is a lot harder for everybody that's involved. So, but he also expects a lot more from the audience. He expects the audience to actually be listening and paying attention. And this I'm going to bring up a lot is that to what degree can you completely miss what's going on in the movement because you weren't paying attention, right? Because a lot of Beethoven's music, it compels you to pay attention. But these symphonies can get really long. Your attention you can get sleepy, you can zone out, and some of the bigger meanings can get lost because you're not paying attention. And Beethoven's starting to say, you're not just an idle audience member coming in for just some nice music. It's for this kind of next level of engagement, of the more you pay attention, the more you're going to enjoy it. And that's kind of true of every Beethoven, which I will talk about later on. So, the second movement for this symphony is kind of nice because he's continuing this soft, airy, nice heavenly garden aesthetic. Lot of nice paintings, can be quite masterful, masterful painting of a sailing navy ship out in the coast. A lot of charming, good stuff, and in fact, the second movement actually uses a nice melody. And so you don't always hear Beethoven's stuff having nice melodies, but this one has a decent one to carry you through. So, this one, also solid. B. 3 and 4 is very akin to what I was saying before, is like that movement 3 jubilant rhythmic section. But in my opinion, it's not that special. You can still have if you had a guessing game, you could still guess that it's Beethoven, but it's not like the most representative of his music as a whole. So I'm going to put that in C. I'm going to put number 4 in C as well. And the idea is that Well, you should also note that the Second Symphony was, at the time, one of Beethoven's more stressful time periods, and so musicologists say that he was suffering some gastrointestinal issues throughout his entire life, and that in the fourth movement, he actually leaned into his sickness, and that one of the reasons why some people found this movement to be kind of repulsive is that uh, some of that music is inspired by hiccups, farts, and burps, you know? So keep that in mind, I guess, is that he was not well while doing this. All right. Moving on to Symphony number 3. So, like I was alluding to before with Symphony 2, Symphony 3 is when you have to start buying into Beethoven. Because again, he demands something more of the audience. Like, the more you pay attention, the more you get out of it. The more you're a fan of his music, the more you're going to enjoy it. You know, you gotta buy into it, lean into it. There are many things about Beethoven that I don't like or agree with, but sometimes if I just like say buy into Beethoven, I actually end up enjoying it more. Um, and that really is true with the Third Symphony. Is like this is the first symphony where you really feel like Beethoven has stepped away from who he used to consider as his mentors, and that he started really starting to believe that probably by this point that he was the best. Um, and what makes this so different is the whole idea of subversion of expectations. There are so many, from the very get-go, it invites mystery. It's all just like da 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 da. That little resolution invites mystery from the very beginning. And it goes on for every single bar. There's way more things that you can't correctly predict. If you are listening to this for the first handful of times, you would always be surprised to be like, oh, he does that time, right? So there's a lot more brainiac things of like, what do people expect based on this whole like idea of Haydn and Mozart foundations, and how do I trick them? And his trickery gets a little bit more, more sophisticated. These he starts picking notes that stick out a lot more in the harmonies, things that are a lot more disruptive, and that disruption lasts longer. You'll see like sometimes in the bass there's like some grinding, lasting uncomfortableness that goes on for a long time as the rest of the orchestra is doing their nice music. There's this creeping, crawling nastiness in like the cello section, and then boom, it all resolves. And so there's some unsettlingness that comes up. It's no longer about creating comfortable music, but music that does make you a little untethered, and that's why I think it's such a big step away from the rest of the symphony. So this is where you start getting that meat, right? You're getting your meals, not your snacks, because these are longer ideas, bigger ideas. They're no longer about cute things that sell, right? And one of the reasons why I know that this is good is that starting from this first symphony, when things are quiet, you lean in and you want to listen a little bit more intently. You actually are being drawn in to be blasted away. That's how you know. It's like I already feel so engaged because when it's quiet, I want to learn more and see what's going on. And then a lot of the times he surprises you with an explosive entrance, right? So what can I say? It is simply perfect. First movement is our first sublime movement, folks. It belongs nowhere else than where it is right now. Now the second movement is this incredibly, again, dense, deep, emotionally. You get this really big death funeral march idea, kind of like Mozart, right? And Mozart's Requiem. A lot of what I think about when I see like funeral marches, I think about the Requiem and a lot of the other Requiems out there. And what I like about this is that you get this really incredible depiction of heaven, hell, salvation, despair. But unlike Mozart and the Catholic or Catholic Catholic representation of heaven and hell, where the humans are just like playing pieces like in checkers, there's a little bit more of a human element. There is a person in this equation. Like the person is experiencing heaven, the person experiencing hell, whereas before those were just kind of destinations that you didn't really interact with. You just went there, you know. And so in that second movement, you're lifted away. You are simply just taken as a living being and placed into the realm of the dead. You know, it's like you have post-mortem experience as a living person. Because you get to see the grandeur and the pristine bliss of like this heavenly sound, but also the incredible weight and burden from these more of these hellish vibes. So there's a lot more ego involved in terms of the person being involved in this heaven and hell exchange, which previously you didn't see that as much because it was very much Catholic setup. So another new thing about this is that he introduces fugues into his symphonies. His previous two didn't have any fugal sections, I don't think. Correct me if I'm wrong. But to insert a fugue into a symphony is actually a big statement. Because by this time, a fugue is somewhat of a dying trend. You do it to do it as like an academic exercise and to show people how smart you are. And fugues show up a lot in like these string quartets, string ensemble stuff. But to bring it into a symphony is a big decision. And what's great about this inclusion of the fugue is that it's bringing this scale of an organ, but the specificity and precision of an orchestra. The instrumentation is all of it. It feels like an organ with some new bells and whistles. And with fugues, it can be very dense, complicated music, but the fact that it sounds nice and digestible is a skill in and of itself. It's one thing to write a fugue that fits all of the rules, but it's also a totally different thing to write a fugue that's nice to listen to and isn't so burdensome that you lose attention. Like sometimes with fugues, they can get so long or rather so complicated that you get lost. And then you get tired. You even get tired listening to it very actively. It's a very cognitively expensive thing to do. Listen to fugues. And so, you know, what he wrote in this movement is not simple. It is a very sophisticated fugue. but the fact that it actually sounds nice is incredible, right? Um, but one thing about this movement is that it provokes sleepiness. And I think in this movement, it is the wrong time to be sleepy. This is one of those moments where if you really pay attention through the whole thing, it is something else. But it is somewhat easier to tune out, and then you kind of miss the point, right? You just kind of, if you're kind of sleeping and then you're moving three, entirely possible. But for the person that's going to pay attention and enjoy it to the fullest extent, there's only one choice: Sublime. I would even put it above movement one. This one's kind of interchangeable. It depends on how I feel at the time. But one and two, real good. Top tier. Fantastic. So, movement three, you have to realize this is a 50-minute symphony, estimated. You are halfway through. By now, most symphonies would have ended. Pretty much all symphonies prior to this one would have ended by now. And so you as an audience, you're kind of in that hot, steamy environment. You're just like, oh my god, when the hell is this gonna end, right? Third movement comes, wakes you up so hard. You know? It's a real necessary pick me up to the whole symphony, so that it energizes you towards the end, right? Because again, it's long. It's a big expectation on the audience to say, please be focused for 50 minutes on this thing. So it's a tall order to ask. But what's nice about this is that it's that jubilant, boisterous dancing, and I think it's just next level because it's way easier to fall into it. You know, you can easily just like fall into the idea of what's going on there. And but in terms of the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's sublime. I think it's excellent. And it again has a nice purpose of bringing you back into the symphony. Just lures you right in. And so I'm going to put this in the A tier. And of course, in that third movement, like I said about Beethoven's identity growing at the same time that brass is growing as well, the brass goes so hard in movement three. And so if you're a horn player, you're a brass player, I can totally see that this movement three would be ranked up a little higher. Because the brass go so hard. Movement four. Movement four is when you kind of see you see elements of Beethoven trickery in Symphony 1, Symphony 2. But this Symphony 3 Movement 4, it goes a little bit more beyond in terms of how clowny it can get. But I think I should start off by saying that Symphony 3 Movement 4 is so comprehensive that it could have easily been an entire symphony on its own for any other composer. It has a lot of different sections, one idea expressed in many different musical forms. And so it may seem like, oh my god, this is taking forever to end. Kind of like the ending of Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, of all these different things that they have to do to conclude the story. It kind of feels like that with so many of these different ideas. Something about this is that this seems to be like the first proper finale where it's no longer just a finale. Because in a lot of these 4-part symphonies, the finale was not super long. It was like an actual showy conclusion to a symphony. But this is when Beethoven says, okay, the fourth movement is a finale, but it's no different in terms of its explorative potential than the other three movements. And so you'll start seeing long fourth movements that just, you know, um, will uh, have tons of exposition, basically. Um, Another thing about the whole idea of this being comprehensive as a finale is, and this is true across the whole symphony as you go along, is that there are specific ideas across the movements of the symphony, but there's some sort of like thematic preservation as you go throughout. It kind of it's not so true about the third symphony. There are more, and I'll bring this up later on. But there's more callbacks to the previous movements to make it seem like, hey, this is the same trilogy or the same four-part movie series that you've been watching, you know? Um, but it is quite long. Um, so, what I think of this finale is that unfortunately, the finale to the finale is not that cool because pretty much all of Beethoven's finales are going to be dominant arpeggios. I'm not humming it correctly, but that whole dominant chord resolution where you're holding just one chord for a long time, you're going comes up in romantic music everywhere. Beethoven has kind of pioneered that. That shows up here, and that ending comes out of nowhere. So I think the finale to the finale is I don't know, a little surprising. But overall, it is a big work. So I'm gonna place this in the A tier. So here we go. Pretty fantastic, right? The third symphony has got S's and A's. I will say it's one of the best. This is where you really start getting that big Beethoven identity. You start seeing all the tricks, new mechanics that Beethoven uses to make his music more compelling. You're pulled into listening, but also in ways that he expresses himself as a trickster, as like a playful kid. That is all just like happening. It's really great. The fourth symphony is an interesting thing that sticks in there. If you listen from the 1 till 9, I'm not going to say chronologically because that's a whole different other topic. I don't think that the symphonies were written 1 through 9 in order. And this is one of those examples because Symphony 4 appears to be going back to Symphony 2 and 1 in terms of style, in terms of mechanics, is simply just not as dense as the third one. And so what I'm thinking is that Beethoven was probably working on this symphony at the same time as the third symphony. He's probably focusing more on the third one, and that he either came back to finish this symphony or he really wanted to do different experiments on here's kind of this older style and here's kind of this new style I'm developing. So I think that this fourth one could probably be the third one, and the third one could be the fourth one, in terms of chronology of when they were written. And so this idea of subverting expectations seems a little half-baked. A lot of the interesting new and tension creating devices don't, some of that's not there. It's really just jump scares in the first movement. Jump scares, um, a lot of evidence that he really intentionally wants to mess with the audience, and so it seemed like, yeah, Beethoven was not only writing for himself in that he wants to trick the audience, but he wants the audience to be involved in some way, right? And so, on one hand, he wants to trick the audience, but he wants the audience to be having the fun too. But unfortunately, it sounds a lot like Haydn, and I'm really not a big fan of Haydn. If you've gathered that by now, and so in my opinion, this movement is entirely skippable. If you want to see that big, if you want to use the Symphony 4 as like another stepping stone between Haydn and Beethoven, this is one of those moments. Alright, so for movement 2, 3, and 4, all I gotta say is that it's super weak. It's super weak. It's going back to this kind of like Mozart vibe, but it kind of goes apart. It kind of, I don't know, it sounds insulting. Sorry for everyone who's a big fan of this symphony, but it sounds like a work that Mozart created that he didn't care about. You know, Mozart was just writing this on an off Saturday, and that's kind of how it comes across. Um, it's just some ideas in the second movement also are in the third movement, so I kind of feel, or in the third symphony, sorry. So I feel like the fourth symphony again, if I think of this hypothesis that the fourth symphony was being written at the same time as the third symphony, that some of these ideas going on in the fourth symphony creeped up much better in the third symphony. Because I don't want to believe that Beethoven did the third symphony, wrote the second movement of the fourth symphony, and decided I'm going to write something that's way worse. There's no way. And so I just assume this is again a previous idea that's a little half baked that's going to end up in the third symphony. All you historians and musicologists out there, come at me if that's not correct. So I'm going to put movement 2 and movement 3 into the D tier. Very skippable. So now the fourth movement. Um, the fourth movement is where you start not having very stable ideas. It's very frantic and bipolar. You get really fast, really slow, really happy, really sad, and it just happens very swiftly. So it never seems like a certain idea sticks as much as in like the third symphony where lines can go on for a long time. And so this is kind of a good demonstration of kind of the type of character Beethoven could have been, is this very frantic bipolar person that had such extreme emotions one way or the other, and still having this trickster identity, having fun. And so I think it's still a little bit more interesting than the other movements, but they are but the movement is still very repetitive. Not repetitive with measures, but with notes. Just like the same note over and over and over sometimes. So it can get quite repetitive. But if you wanted to listen to any of it, definitely the fourth movement will give you a good taste of what this whole symphony is about and why it might not be the most representative of Beethoven's quality, but I think his character still shows through. I just think it's a little half baked. So I'm going to put this on D tier, but at the top. All right, here we go, everybody. Symphony 5. What can be said about Symphony 5 that has not been said ever, right? Imagine you exist on this planet at the time of Beethoven. You have an idea of what classical music has been. You have an idea on what Beethoven's music has been. You're a big fan probably of Beethoven if you're showing up to the premiere of the 5 and 6 symphonies, which did premiere on the same day. Huge, you know. And you come in and you hear da 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 da, and that's the whole thing, all moved up and down across the registers, all pieced together in just intricate ways. It's like a real first symphony where you feel like it's uh, meticulously engineered and distilled. You know, it's like distilling music to its simplest concepts, but putting it together in such a sophisticated way that you can't help but think like, wow, this is a Ferrari, you know, or like some other like pristine, uh, Empire State Building as an architectural marvel, right? It's that level of incredibleness, just super well designed. And just from that first movement alone, you would think, okay, I can leave the show having experienced a totally new dimension of music. It was so, I think, compared to everything prior to then, it's so abstracts music. It is no longer just about human emotional evocation, but just how do you make something so conceptually simple and intellectually demanding into such a marvelous work. Um, so you gotta. So I hope I'm starting to, you get the idea of how magical this first movement is and how much of a surprise that it would have been probably at that time, because there's nothing nice to listen to in the first movement. You know, there's no nice melody, there's no anything, but you know for a fact, da 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 da, it's there, you know. And I think that it was a huge pioneer, just like a big new frontier type um, of musical space. But despite the fact that this music is simple, distilled, well engineered, but still kind of this abstract, there's a little abstractness to everything. This is when he never loses this ability to draw in the audience. So when you do something like this, where you look smart doing it, you can easily lose the audience because that intellectual pursuit creates barriers for the common audience. But the fact that he can do something so technical, but also have it so resonating to a common person, it's amazing. It's like he took something that, was something like pure physics, became like an engineer, created this crazy cool stuff based on the scientific theory, and is going like a rock star about it. Pure rock star energy, manic drive. And when you think that the energy cannot go any higher, it goes higher. It's like this whole piece does this, and then suddenly it does this, It just is so intense, and then it goes harder than you can ever believe. And I wrote in my notes that you have never before heard an orchestra so brave and powerful as if wielding a deadly weapon and an unyielding shield. I don't know when I wrote that, but it's so true. You never before have you heard an orchestra as a warrior almost. And so there's nowhere else that this can be except for sublime. And why do I put it behind these Symphony 3 stuff is that you can appreciate it for its intellectual pursuit, but when it comes to like music, there's a lot of other stuff that I enjoy about music than just this kind of academic intellectual pursuit. Although it's incredibly human emotion evocative, it's very evocative. But I think there's some other stuff that is kind of missing from this movement. So, movement 2, and especially from Symphony 5 onwards, is that there's a lot of creating abstract musical spaces that did not exist in previous symphonies. Um, like the Symphony 3 Movement 2 is a big good example of anything prior to Symphony 5 of just saying funeral march. You're drawn into this musical space of remorse, repent, bliss, despair, all of that, right? But the whole idea of movement 2 inviting people into new abstract musical spaces really takes off here because it's kind of like, hey, you're invited into the halls of a champion. You know, I personally, at first, I didn't enjoy this movement so much because it had a lot of brass, and I'm not a big, huge fan of brass, but I didn't understand what was going on in that movement. But I feel like now I do, where you are being invited into the house of a champion. Like, imagine you're invited into the house of Hercules. Mansion with some of the greatest stuff out there. You can't help but walk around the halls and just like feeling like you don't belong there because of how majestic everything is. And that brass, the fanfare, it's like you're following this hero around town and they're saying, "Oh, Lord Hercules has arrived." And everyone's, whenever you see people, they look at him with awe, or her, depending on who your hero is. They're looking at them with awe and speaking very fondly of them with respect and very courteous, And you might, and this person, this hero might be the lord or a ruler of some land that's incredibly prosperous, peaceful, idyllic. You just want to live there under this like beloved lord of the land, right? And this picture that I created, you can create a totally different picture, right? You can see what something else. But the fact that you're able to do that and that everyone's able to see something different, but able to actually envision something based on the music, that's how you know something is different. You know, it makes you want to be creative. It makes you want to visualize. Your brain seems to automatically see visions or ideas of what could be out there in nature or out in the world based on this music that is so detached from what we consider to be natural based on natural sounds and animals and all that, right? So to be able to get into this place of, uh, you know, music abstractness, but be able to see creatively what's out there because of this inspiring music, that's why I think, yeah. So Symphony 5 Movement 2, I'm gonna put in the A tier. Why the A tier? Because I don't think it's very sublime. Because there are some really blaring disruptive brass, which is part of the identity of the piece. But I think it can, for me, it was a bit too much. And the whole idea of invitation into a creative musical space comes up more later on too, you know? So this is the first time that you start getting that invitation. And it's a wild ride. So movement 3 is highly energetic, and it is the first movement that has a very consistent meter and beat, even though all the previous third movements have been very rhythmic and tied to a certain rhythm or beat. This is the one when you feel like Beethoven has made that decision that every third movement kind of going on forward is going to be having one rhythmic identity, or just a couple, that prevails through the whole movement. um, at the same time, it is mysterious, invites intrigue, has this noble sound of, again, a lord or some sort of noble ruler. And it's just got so much more overlying music ideas, multiple entrances, multiple endings pieced together. It really is a lot of music transferring to different parts of the orchestra. You can really see that. So movement 3, I think is good, but you know, it's good Beethoven. So this, for me, only makes it up to the B tier. There are much better renditions of a third movement, a Beethoven third movement later on in these symphonies. And what's great is that it's got this fierce, piercing sound that leads immediately to the fourth movement. Just an immediate transition to the fourth movement. That's a big one. And now let me tell you, the fourth movement really shows how a finale is done. You think it is actually a big ending to this finale. So I think of all the finales, this one's the highest energy one. This is the one that goes on 11 out of 10 for the whole movement. Very high energy. You cannot help but leave the symphony feeling jazzed up. You're buzzing with dopamine because of how wild that ride is and how well that symphony ends. Not much to say, really. It's just not much to say except for the fact that, I don't think any finale was this big up to this point. I can't say more about it, but all I know is that it's sublime. So if you'll notice, Symphony 5 has a little bit more spread in terms of its quality. You got some real high up there moments and then some okay moments. Whereas I think the Symphony number 3 is a little bit more standardized. You can really enjoy beginning to end everything in Symphony 3. Symphony 5, you may be wondering, why there's certain things that are far more popular about Symphony 5 than some of the other stuff, as you probably. Hey y'all, Editor John here. It's taking a little bit of effort getting all these done, and probably gonna split these into 2 parts. Mostly because the 6, 7, 8, 9 took half as much time as the first, and I was getting more tired. So I want to make sure that I have the same level of energy for all of them, and I think I was going faster and faster as I went on. So I want to make sure that they all get their fair share of time. So keep track for part 2. Until then, like, subscribe, comment. Let me know everything about what you've seen so far. And of course, if you want to make any changes or also any, cool stuff that you grew up with and what's special to you about Beethoven. All right, cool. Check you on the next one.